Well, hi everybody, welcome to your Stratosphere Lounge show for the 10th of January, December. Feels like the 10th of September to me. 2018, we made it to 2018 miracle of miracles. I just finished, maybe 40 minutes ago now, I guess. Just finished recording the new firewall. This firewall experiment is so far, you know, we got 1 point. We don't even have a line, let alone a trend. But with one data point down there, it is enormously easier for me to do that. We ended up doing the question of corruption, and I just sat down, looked at the questions this afternoon. I was hoping to do it yesterday. Didn't look at them at all. Didn't see how things were trending. Took a look at it. It's like I thought one of them was it with 37 votes, and I realized no, there's one with 140 or something like that. In any case, it was the one about corruption in the FBI, de-government, all that stuff. So I wrote a firewall called the corruption coma, or our corruption coma, and a little more old school than before. Just a little more of that language, I think, of the early days. And I miss it, and it was nice to have it back. It's been fun. Ben Shapiro's Leaping Buildings in a Single Bound. I'm reading Shakespeare in my place downtown. And it's been a Shakespeare month now for me, I guess. We talked before many times. I'm certainly not going to get into it again. Of my recent interest in, and then, infatuation and almost obsession with Shakespeare. I read 5 or 6 of his plays now, I think, in the last week or two. And it's funny, I have said before as well, that we always end up going to school when we're at our absolute peak stupidity. When we go to college or late high school, we're all teens and all filled with rebellion, and we really just want to see the world and see how it works. And trying to educate somebody like that is extremely difficult, and certainly most of it bounced off of me at the time. But now that my salad days are behind me, I find that it's not only easy, but it's addictive. And when you spend an hour or two a day reading Shakespeare, and sometimes I spend more than that, you find it very difficult to not adopt that tone. And it's great. I was writing about the corruption thing, and the idea is posed in the question that I took in the firewall experiment, that there are people who are just above the law. And I was referring to made some comparisons with It's a Wonderful Life and so on, and I was referring to the FBI as the untouchables. But now the job of the FBI is to protect the American people from the people who need to remain untouched. But there was a line I wrote that I like very much. It wasn't even a line, it was a fragment. I was talking about Comey basically standing up and for half an hour listing all of the things that Hillary Clinton had done, felonies, all of them. And I referred to it as this litany of larceny. I thought that was kind of a clever term. I was rather proud of that. Sometimes you make tiny little gems. They sparkle in your own eyes in the way that maybe major works don't. But in any event, that's basically what's been going on around here. So I see, just from the glance at the top, 2 questions in the comment section. That's all I can see right now. I haven't looked at them yet. I can see that both one question was basically about Max Wild wrote, "What's the airspeed velocity of an unladen swallow?" which I imagine he put up there because it took place in England quite a while ago. 400 or 500 years before Shakespeare, I think. And then Stephen Halas wrote a question in Shakespearean English, which was charming, but I don't think it was about Shakespeare. I think it was about about a line item veto written in Shakespearean language. So if I've been unclear, that's my apologies, but it's certainly not the first time. I want to talk about Shakespeare and answer questions about Shakespeare and his plays and the insights into the guy. And I had always been somewhat immune to his work because I hadn't really read it. And by the way, it is so much clearer. It's so much clearer when you hear it performed. I'd read Titus Andronicus, I want to say 2 days ago, or maybe a little less, and it was very powerful. I liked it very, very much. I identified with Titus Andronicus way too much, I think, as a guy who did not, who was basically destroyed by his own pride and who just simply refused to ingratiate himself with people. They just wouldn't do it. But I read it and I liked it very much. And then I saw Anthony Hopkins do it, and it's so much clearer when it's spoken. It's so much more accessible, and when you have a good actor behind it, it's almost unnoticeable after a while. I felt the same thing about Henry V that was done by Kenneth Branagh. This is the first time I saw Kenneth Branagh, and I thought his Henry V St. Crispin Day speech was maybe the best thing I'd seen in a long time. Far superior to Laurence Olivier's. And now I regret not pulling something that I wish I had pulled. And I may just do the typical Stratosphere Lounge thing and see if I can find it briefly. There's one of the things that's very interesting about Shakespeare to me, is that, and this is absolutely fascinating to me. I am going to look it up enough to remember their names. I don't remember them now. The great thing about this show is I'm automatically connected to the hive mind, and any question I ask, it's like Siri with a 15-second delay. But this father and son combination of linguists basically worked out what Shakespeare sounded like. We know what his words were, but what he sounded like. And they were able to I think very accurately reproduce what Shakespeare sounded like to Shakespearean audiences. And he sounded a lot more American than British. There's details of this story that I don't really know yet, but I have heard it basically said that, so the English colonists come to America, and basically the American sound in English is closer to what English was than the British sound that we hear today, because at some point the British toffee noses went to, I think, like a specific teacher or something who taught them this very affected British accent, which was not how people spoke at all, and this father-son team. I'm going to find Hamlet. I'm going to take the time to find it and then play it. This young actor, son of the linguist, also a linguist, was talking about the difference as an actor, because he's a very good actor as well. He's talking about the difference in the performance of Shakespeare in original pronunciation, and I think it's received pronunciation, which is what we use today. So he said that if you're an actor and you're using the Shakespeare voice that you've been told to use, and that is the Shakespeare voice of the Royal Shakespeare Company, and it's the Shakespeare voice of Laurence Olivier, and he says it's very high, and your chin is very high, and you don't move at all, and it's all delivered into the air in this very, very light fashion, and overdone and just extremely artificial. There was a period long after Shakespeare died, really peaked in the Victorian era, when Shakespeare was actually idolized and became what he is today, which is not just a good writer, it's this kind of mystical legend, bardology, I think they call it. But this young actor was basically saying that when you pronounce Shakespeare, when you act Shakespeare, speak Shakespeare, in received pronunciation, the way we think he sounded, he said, everything's up here and your voice is much higher and you stand very erect like this. And, you know, two houses, both alike in dignity, and so on. And he said, when you get to how they actually sounded, he said it's not only a faster sound, but it's a much earthier sound. And it brings his shoulders down and hunches him over a little bit and speeds him up and makes it much, much, much more common. Two houses, both alike in dignity, is much lower like that. And I saw his Hamlet soliloquy, and I'm going to just find it, and I'm sorry, this is the nature of the show. Perhaps you can talk amongst yourselves. This shouldn't take too long. But basically, his Hamlet soliloquy is using another thing that Shakespeare used quite a lot of, and that's asides, when he would speak directly to the audience. And it's tremendous. So, let me see, original. Here it is. Ben Crystal is his name, and if I don't know his father's name, but I'm going to go to the trouble of downloading this, and then I'm going to go to the trouble of actually playing it for you because it's just tremendous. So in order to do that, I have to do this. And I really should have had this prepared. I didn't think about it until just now, so there you go. Sometimes you have to wait for things that are worth waiting for. Copy. Converter. How's everybody else doing, by the way? It started to rain here a couple days ago for the first time in forever. I didn't think it was ever going to rain again. But finally some weather here. Okay, we're downloading this thing. It's a short little video. It's about 2.5 minutes. David and Ben Crystal. They did a production of Romeo and Juliet at the Globe Theater, which is just a few feet away from, or I suppose I should say a few meters away from where the Globe originally stood. And he said that the performance of Romeo and Juliet in original pronunciation was 10 minutes faster than it was in received pronunciation. And furthermore, he said that they did two versions of the play. They did it in received pronunciation, which again is the kind of Shakespeare you would like, two houses, both alike in dignity. And it turned out that they'd choreographed a dance number to the dialogue in received pronunciation. And when they did the show in original pronunciation, the way it would have actually sounded, he said that that they just simply ran out of speaking, and they just had to dance in silence for a minute or two because they'd choreograph this number and they'd run out of dialogue. So let's see if I got it here, and I'll download this. Why didn't it come down? Hang on. Oh, it didn't give me this flash player out of date thing, honestly, really. It's bad enough. It's embarrassing enough. In any event, it is really absolutely remarkable the difference it makes to hear him the way he was supposed to be heard. And one of the things that was most fascinating about this was that one of the ways that they could tell what he sounded like in the original pronunciation was because words that do not rhyme in modern English do rhyme in original pronunciation. This is just causing me some real pain. I have this online YouTube converter, and it's trying to download some malware, but by God, I'm going to do it. It's worth it. It really is worth it. And this is our Shakespeare show, so if we had a producer, we'd be in much better shape by now. But basically, that's it. And you realize how earthy he was, and in a good way. When I say earthy, that that sounds, it sometimes has a kind of a sort of a taint against it. But please don't do this to me. Honestly, just give me the frickin' file. Can you do that? Can you just? There it is. No, it's not. Um, it's so much more connected to people. And there it comes. Hooray! And so Shakespeare becomes more... Hang on a second, kids. It's the audio-only version. We'll get it if it kills me, so help me God, we will. And you can tell I'm just backpedaling now. But really what it comes down to is that this was a guy who understood people on such a profound level that virtually all of his characters are completely real people. They're kings sound like real people, and soldiers sound like real people. And here it is, and there it is. Hooray! That's a good start. And now I shall bring it into Ustream, and there it is. And I'm going to hope that this is working. It's 2.5 minutes, but this is Hamlet's soliloquy as it sounded, and very likely as it was performed on the stage of the Globe Theatre when William Shakespeare was actually there listening to it. So I'm going to go to the silent tab for 1 second. I'll be right. The play's about to begin.
Whenever you're ready. And just take your time, Ben.
Hamlet, take 2. To be or not to be, that is the question. Whether it is nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against, essay troubles, and by opposing, end them. To die, to slay, no more, and by a slave to say we end the heartache and 1,000 natural shocks that flesh is heir to. 'Tis a consummation devoutly to be wished. To die, to sleep perchance to dream, aye, there's the rub. For in that sleep of death, what dreams may come when we have shuffled off this mortal coil must give us pause. There's the respect that makes calamity a so long life, for who would bear the whips and scorns of time? The oppressor's wrong, the poor man's contumely, the pangs of disprized love, the law's delay, the insolence of office, and the spurns that Pacian merit the unworthy takes, when he himself might his quietus make with a bare bodkin. Who would these fathers bear to grunt and sweat under a weary life? But that the threat of something after death, the undiscovered country, from whose bourne no traveller returns, puzzles the will, and makes us rather bear those ills we have than fly to others that we know not of. Thus, conscience doth make cords of us all, and thus the native hue of resolution is sicklied o'er with the pale cast of thought and enterprises of great pith and moment with this regard. Let currents turn awry, and loose the name of action. Soft, you know, the Ferrophilia.
Oh, I knew that was going to happen. Sorry about that. Yeah. This is one of the things that is. I mean, just listening to that Hamlet soliloquy, we heard the title of at least 2 or 3 movies. What Dreams May Come, a Robin Williams movie, is directly from that. The Undiscovered Country, the Star Trek movie, is directly from that. It's astonishing how much of our language comes from this guy, and as an aside, that way, what he was doing in that particular monologue, which is probably the most famous monologue in the world, just gets a lot clearer, because it's not some noble, lofty, philosophical argument. It's basically a guy who, I mean, in essence, what that monologue is saying is, I should probably just kill myself, and it'd be much easier if I killed myself. In fact, all these people that have these horrible lives, they should all kill themselves too. Why would you continue to labor under these kind of horrible conditions and endure all of these things when you could simply just slip away with a bare bodkin, with an unsheathed dagger? And he says, because of the dreams, because of the fact that there may be something worse, you know. That's the rub. There's the rub. It's basically what Hamlet is doing there is he's doing a cost-benefit analysis for suicide. And he comes to the conclusion that since what may come after death is potentially so terrifying, that he's not going to do it. And then he comes to a second conclusion, which is internal to the monologue. This is just my take on it. I haven't read any of this. I haven't read any critics on Shakespeare, because I think those people just give you their ideas, and I'd like to have my own. But what seems to me there is that Hamlet is doing a cost-benefit analysis for suicide and decides that it's not worth it, that it's better to live. And I think at the end of that monologue, he realizes that this is exactly what he was looking for. He was looking for an excuse to not kill himself, because Hamlet is all about indecision. Hamlet is all about the struggle to actually do things as opposed to talk about them. And it seems at the very end of that he realizes that he's just made this whole argument against suicide because he doesn't have the guts to go through with it. Conscience doth make cowards of us all. And the idea that action, which is clear, you know, that taking action, you know what to do. When you see something that needs to be done, you know what to do. But that is cast over with the sickly veil of thought, and you start to think about things and weigh them, and it basically robs you of all of your ambition and all of your motive and drive, and you end up just talking and thinking about things, which is essentially why Hamlet is basically a modern day progressive. He's big on rhetoric and poor on action. He's constantly looking at himself, wondering why he's not actually doing what he thinks he should be doing. It's a, you know, if you'd written just that play, in fact, if you'd written just that soliloquy, you'd be remembered. But it's just it's a fragment of a play that's filled with these kind of things, and that play is just a fragment of a life, of an opus of things that are so remarkable that that they just, you know, they need talking about. I have been where is it? Hang on, this will not take so long. And by the way, I hope you feel that the delay for that was worth it, because I certainly thought it was. So when I was reading this Shakespeare, complete works of Shakespeare, I went in and I just started to highlight things that caught my eye. Some of these would be famous scenes, but some of them not. Some of them were just snatches of dialogue or lines that I thought were interesting, and there are hundreds and hundreds of them. And I'm just going to, prior to taking some of the questions, I'm just going to go through the ones I pulled from Titus Andronicus, which is what I read just prior to what I'm reading now, which is, what am I reading now? Othello. So I'm just going to skip ahead and see what I find, and we'll just go through this just very briefly, because, look, it's my show. I get to do whatever I want, I guess. But mostly I'm just so interested in this because his characters are so well developed, and the things he talks about are so amazing. But basically what I'm looking for is I'm looking for areas or words where he's basically caught everything in a sentence. That pretty much everything everything you need to know about this particular thing is caught in one sentence. Here's the first one. So in Titus Andronicus, one of the bad guys, Chiron, he's the son of the queen, and he says, "Foul-spoken coward, that thunderest with thy tongue, and with thy weapon nothing darest perform." That's not a particularly brilliant particular passage, but there it is. You've got a big mouth and all talk and no action. The one of the characters that I just simply had not ever heard of was Aaron the Moor in Titus Andronicus, who is as spectacular a villain as Iago and far more demonstrative. So I'm going to see if I can find some of his stuff, because it's you know what it is? It's like, it's so essential. When I say essential, I don't mean essential in terms of essential to your education. It's essential in that some of these passages go right to the heart of the emotion, and it's great. Here's a line. "Alas, poor heart, that kiss is comfortless as frozen water is to a starved snake." I want to get to Aaron, though, because he's... And then we'll take the questions. So this Aaron, who's basically the cause of all of this revenge against Titus Andronicus, upon which Titus Andronicus gets a much heavier revenge, is just simply, utterly, gleefully evil. He's not conflicted. He's not like Iago deceptive. He's just simply, he's not only proud of how evil he is, he's just jubilant about it. All right, here we go. Hang on. I don't know if any of you have had experience of reading much of this, and I can't remember how to do the just finding the highlights on this, so I suppose this is going to take, this will be the only one I actually just read for. Well, okay then. Well, of course, needless to say, I don't have it marked out, so I'm just going to stop doing this right now. Yeah. Okay. Sorry about that. I had a bunch of these things highlighted, but that's not really important, and my take on it is not really important. The reason I wanted to do a show about Shakespeare was, first of all, that we haven't done a theme topic in a while, and secondly, this whole thing is so under attack. This whole idea of Shakespeare and dead white males and poets, and the idea that Shakespeare's no different than some Mongolian poet, who wrote in the 12th century, and it's just as good. It's not just as good. It's not just as good. There's nobody this good at this, and not only is nobody this good at this, nobody's this good at it as often as he's good at it. So maybe the reason I'm so fascinated by him now at this stage in my life is I've basically been making a living as a writer for 15 years now, I guess, which was always my dream. And I look and see how my work has evolved and changed, and like all people, like all artists who are any good, you go back and look at the first stuff you did, and you almost can't bear to read it. Hopefully, I think the reason that actors don't like seeing earlier performances, artists don't like to look at their early paintings, is because they are embarrassed by how far they've come. Now, I know a lot of people like the first work I did, and many of you probably think it was better than the work I've been doing lately. But at the very least, over the course of a decade or so, you pick up technique, you pick up just a sort of a fluency that you didn't have before. Writing is a business like any other business, and if you make enough pancakes, you get faster at making good pancakes than you did in the beginning. And as I've gotten older, and as my mind has opened up considerably in the time that we've all known each other, I look at this and I begin to get the sense from Shakespeare that I've only gotten from Mark Twain, and that is, as I read more and more of him, I begin to feel like I know the guy. And that's something I did not expect at all. The first time I read Twain and read The Innocents Abroad, I felt like he was sitting next to me telling me the whole story. And having read every single thing that Mark Twain ever wrote, I feel like he's a friend. He's just a friend who's gone. I'm starting to get that sense from Shakespeare. Some of the jokes are very clever, and some of them are very base. But in any event, what he achieved is so far above the norm of the work that I do and that all the people in my occupation do, that it has to be fascinating. A lot of people are intimidated by this. A lot of people are you can generally tell second-rate talent by the reaction to first-rate talent. People who are good at what they do and know that they're good at what they do like being around people who are better at what they do than they are. They like it. It's actual fun. It's pleasure. I'm an okay writer. I'm a pretty good writer, I think. I think, and I'm always so reluctant to make statements like this, but in a room that's a sympathetic room, I'm the best public speaker I've ever seen. And only once have I been in a room where I saw somebody speaking and I just went, oh my God. And that was Glenn Beck. I was sitting 3 feet away from him, and Beck was just masterful. And seeing somebody do that, I'm sure I said this before, you feel like you're the trying out for the Yankees or something, and you're coming up from the farm leagues. You're some 19-year-old. You think you got a fastball. You can throw a 103-mile-an-hour fastball, and you step into Yankee Stadium for a tryout, and up there on the mound is like the world's most famous pitcher, and he's just throwing 120-mile-an-hour fastballs like there's no tomorrow. And then you have to ask yourself, can you be that good? Could you be that good if you put your mind to it? If you gave it everything you had, could you match what you see there, or even perhaps surpass it? That's for people who love what they do, and for people who take what they do seriously and who are not filled with an inferiority complex. It's actually a joy. It's a genuine joy. But there are other people who look at that as a threat, and they don't like it. They don't like mentioning or being seen in the same company as people who are better than them, because to them that just simply shows out how far they fall short. You can't tell how far you fall short until you know what you're falling short of, and the only way to remedy that situation is to understand why some things are so good and some things not so good. When you take billions and billions of people over certainly centuries of recorded history, maybe millennia, you're going to have some people way out there at 7 sigma, 8 sigma or so, and you're going to have a handful of names, and we know these names. Albert Einstein is just in physics, Newton as well. Unimaginably brilliant and far beyond the norm, and this actually connects to a lot of things, because you realize that this kind of natural genius that Einstein has with mathematics, that Shakespeare has with language, it not only does it mesmerize you and amaze you, but it also shows you the limits of what we are able to do, what regular people can do. It shows you our limits, and that should be a humbling experience, and a lot of people need humbling experiences. Me being one of them, certainly, and I've gotten a few. But being in the presence of that kind of greatness that is just simply so far beyond your best work is something that you should probably carry with you every day, because you realize what people are capable, what humans, Homo sapiens, the species, is capable of producing once in a, I don't know, 10 billion, once in 5 billion, something like that. And you can see what we're capable of. And that is so mystifying to us that it should serve as a warning for when we become so certain about things and think we have all the answers because I'm a newsman and I've got an IQ of 102, therefore I get to tell everybody what to do. So that's really it to me. That's what I really wanted to talk about, and hopefully we'll find some questions on this particular line. The idea of the person and words that could capture so many elements of the human condition in such a way that so much of it that we don't understand is just built into language. Post haste, things, just little things. He basically invented all of them. So let's dig into the comment sections here and see what we can find. And as I said earlier, apologies to anybody, but I'm going to just try and take to questions that are about Shakespeare or about one of his plays. So let's see. Okay, good. Here's one. Stan Sears says, in Romeo and Juliet, the Montague-Capulet feud over some long forgotten slight drove the tragedy. How much of today's Republican, Democrat, or conservative progressive, if you prefer, has the same meaningless animosity, and how much is principled disagreement? Can tragedy be avoided? That's an interesting question. I was quite shocked at how bad I thought Romeo and Juliet was. It was one of his very early plays, might have been his second or third, as I understand it. I'm not a Shakespearean scholar by any means. But having come off of some of his later work first, and then reading Romeo and Juliet, I was really quite shocked at how bad it is relative to his other work. Needless to say, I remember reading it and thinking West Side Story was considerably better than this, I think. So the question is, are our present differences necessary, or are they simply just constantly waving the bloody shirt at each other and living in this cycle of vengeance and vendetta that depopulated Italy, for so much of its time? The difference between progressives and conservatives are not trivial, and they live with us every day. They're not historical disagreements in the way that many theological arguments are. There are still people who kill each other over the shape of the menorah, or whether or not Christ was crucified with his feet one over the top of the other, or separate. The people used to kill each other over that, and there are probably some people out there who are still willing to do it. Those kind of arguments are way, way back, and really have no meaning for us today, and for scholars even. It's, some of these things have been debated for so long that they're simply just, there's no new juice you can squeeze out of them. And our situation with the progressives is not that at all. But what's interesting about your question, Stan, is the remedy. In Romeo and Juliet, it's the loss of their dearest that causes them to put down their feud. Presumably, in backstory for Romeo and Juliet, the Montagues and the Capulets had been having a feud for decades, if not a century or two. And in Fair Verona, where we set our tale. And so both Montague and Capulet, the leaders of the families, had to lose what they cherished the most before they could finally break out of this, which is, of course, another example of the theme that seems to me to be most predominant in the Shakespeare that I've read so far, and it seems to be honestly a very, very recurring theme. And the theme is basically the sin of pride. the sin of pride, the sin of digging your heels in, and it's not unjustified pride. As I said, I read Titus Andronicus, and I thought he was absolutely right to not kowtow to these plebes who basically were, just rabble. Shakespeare said, one guy's a villain today, tomorrow he'll be your hero, and vice versa, and so on. So the motivation is certainly understandable for me, and sometimes I actually think it's exemplary. But it's the thing. It becomes clearer and clearer to me that it's the thing. Is this pride of feeling like I know the truth and you don't. So, will some enormous catastrophe cause us to reunite with the left? I can certainly imagine a world where that happens. I can imagine a world where a pandemic or something of that nature, alien invasion, makes all of these differences that we have, especially as Americans, relatively trivial. And not to butter the bread too heavily here, but all of the situations that I can think of to bring left and right together involve contact with the real world, forcing us to put down philosophical differences, and therein lies the difference between the two of us. We tend to believe in practical experience and common sense, and the left is just adoring of theory and philosophy and ideas that sound good on paper. It's an old saw. It was one of my favorites, progressive would ask, yeah, sure, it works in practice, but does it work in theory? And that's it in a nutshell, really. So I think the fight is real, and I don't think it's a trivial kind of a thing. I'm quite sure that in Romeo and Juliet, I certainly don't remember Shakespeare ever addressing the initial cause of the feud between the two families, which is exactly how you handle it, right? I mean, that's precisely how you handle it. You've got these two families killing each other, and nobody knows why. The audience never finds out why. And the audience doesn't find out why because neither side knows why. It's just what they do. It's kind of like that Star Trek episode. By the way, I don't know how many Star Trek episodes were named out of fragments of Shakespeare, but I do know that Conscience of the King was, Dagger of the Mind, Gamesters of Triskelion, I'm pretty sure was not a Shakespearean phrase. But in any event, it's that sin of pride and of knowing that that really basically gets us into so much trouble. All right, so moving on here. Daniel Frampton, in what way might Shakespeare's plays about monarchs such as Henry V have something to say about the U.S. presidency itself, specifically regarding themes of leadership, loyalty, and patriotism? These are exactly the kind of questions I was hoping we would get today. Thank you very much for that, Daniel. That's wonderful. Again, speaking as a person who has heard of Shakespearean scholars but doesn't pretend to be one, I have to answer that. Dave Big Booty says the feud was the MacGuffin. That's exactly right. The MacGuffin is a term, back to Romeo and Juliet, I'll come back to this question in a second. It just popped up, and it needs to be addressed because it's an excellent point. MacGuffin was a term that Hitchcock used to drive the story. It was simply the thing that people were pursuing. It wasn't in itself intrinsically interesting. Like, for instance, the Maltese Falcon is the MacGuffin. Everybody's trying to find the Maltese Falcon. What is the Maltese Falcon? It's a statue. It doesn't have any meaning at all. The only meaning that it has is to drive the story of the search for it. And so Hitchcock called this the MacGuffin. And I suppose he named it that because it was completely unimportant. It just simply had to be there. It was the off-stage motivation that you have to give to people so that the actions on stage become explainable, believable, comprehensible. But it in itself has essentially zero meaning, very little meaning. I believe that Hitchcock, I keep wanting to say Churchill, that Hitchcock's, probably his attitude about all of this was summed up, this is, I think, about right. North by Northwest ends with Cary Grant, and I forget her name, hanging from a cliff. just about to drop to their deaths, and apparently then it just cuts, because I haven't seen it in 100 years. Then it cuts to them, they're just fine someplace, and somebody came up to him and said, well, how did they get off of the cliff? You left them literally cliffhanger. That's what the term came from. You left them hanging from the cliff. How did they get into this railway car after this or whatever? Why didn't you explain that? How could you not show it? And Hitchcock turned to this fellow and just said, don't be droll, my dear boy. And it's the perfect answer, right? Don't be droll. Don't belabor a point. If you missed the point that badly, you're beneath an explanation of it. Don't make a mountain out of a storytelling molehill. So anyway, back to this question I like so much. So as I said, I'm not a Shakespeare scholar by any means, but I have read of them. It was on a train, thanks, David. But I do know that Shakespeare was writing during the time of Elizabeth I, and during that time, having your head remaining attached to your shoulders was a bit of a trick. There's some, and I'll get to this whole thing in a sort of a broader sense. Basically, in a nutshell, for the 100 years prior to Shakespeare starting his writing, or maybe even more, was a historical, ongoing, running British Civil War. The British Civil War was originally, is today recognized as the time when Oliver Cromwell executed Charles I, and for, 12 years or 11 or 14 or something, Britain didn't have a king. It had a commonwealth with Oliver Cromwell at the head of it. And that battle was called the British Civil War. But really, the British Civil War was earlier than that, and it involved these two families, the Yorks and the Lancashires, Lancasters, and each one of them in one of Shakespeare's plays. I think it was, I should know this, I just read it. Henry, one of the Henrys. In any event, the Lancasters had basically the Henry series of models, and the York family had basically the Richard series of models. And since Shakespeare was writing in the time of a Tudor, but basically being a Henry, Shakespeare had to legitimize basically the Red Rose case of the Lancasters and delegitimize the York case for the previous 100 years, which is why Richard III is such a tremendous, unbelievably terrific, villainous character, because Richard III was the previous York king. And Shakespeare had to come down pretty hard on the side of the Lancasters because, I'm not going to say his life depended on it, but certainly it was the smart play politically. And obviously this was called the War of the Roses because each side wore a red rose for the Lancasters and a white rose for the House of York. And so that is the source of almost all of Shakespeare's historical plays, the ones that are not fictional, like Julius Caesar is generally considered a tragedy, not a history, even though Julius Caesar was a historical character. It's not really based on the history. But Henry II, Henry IV and Henry V, Henry VI, Part 1, Part 2, and Part 3, Henry VIII, Richard III, all of this. It's all this ongoing war between these two factions, and therein hangs a tale. Some tremendous language in those historical plays. And you mentioned, Daniel, Henry V. And Henry V is so inspirational because I suspect that even though it was many, many years before Shakespeare wrote it, the British were still astonished by and bathing in the glow of Agincourt, which happened in, I want to say, 1416, something like that. And I don't remember. It sounds right, but in any event, right around there. So here you have this small band of Englishmen led by this young king on this mission to conquer all of France with just a handful of guys who were sick with dysentery and barely alive, and the French bring out all of their nobility and all of their home field advantage, and thousands and thousands and thousands of armored knights, and the British longbowmen basically beat them. Which, parenthetically, if you didn't hear this from the show already, is why the British version of sending somebody the bird is this. Churchill basically did this to the Germans, and he basically was making it very clear to all of his British subjects, not his subjects, rather his British fellow subjects, that basically he was saying a big F you to Hitler. And when people finally realized that this was a bit vulgar, Churchill turned it around and made it the V for victory. But that's not where it comes from. It comes from this. This is the English form of the middle finger. And the reason that this is the English form of the middle finger is because when the French would capture English soldiers, certainly if they were archers, and probably all of them, the French would cut off the first two fingers of their right hands because these were the two fingers that you used to draw a bow. And basically, there were prisoner exchanges and hostages and all that stuff. But basically what the French did was, they cut off these first two fingers on British bowmen because they were so deadly. The British longbowmen were the revolution in military affairs. They were finally effective long-range weapons, and they won handily. And the French weren't so fond of that. So basically what a Brit is doing here, whether he knows it or not, is he's saying, I've still got my shooting fingers, you miserable son of a bitch. There was a whole political substructure of that. But when you got to Henry V, you almost feel, not almost, you feel Shakespeare's natural patriotism just bursting off of the page. When you read Henry VI, which is about the loss of France, with a weak king and ongoing battles, and all of this led to Richard III and so on. It's actually, Henry VI is a 3 plays called Henry VI, Part 1, 2, and 3. They're all about shame and dishonor and just sort of the hangdog sense of, our noble ancestor had basically become king of France as well as England, and now here we are and we barely can hold on to Calais. But Henry V was a real butt kicker. Henry V was Patton, and he was, Achilles, and he was Alexander, and he was all these great champions of the culture. He was Superman. I think you could probably make the case. He had accomplished so much with so little that when it's time to talk about Henry V, Shakespeare starts the play with the same kind of, I don't want to say kid glove treatment, but with the same kind of overall sort of setting up here's a faction, it's very Shakespearean. But when you get to the battlefield, you can just feel that he's just cut the brakes off. He's just rolling now. And you end up with the Henry V soliloquy, the Band of Brothers speech, which is, I think, the most motivational speech ever written. Far superior to anything in Lord of the Rings, although there's some good moments in there too. In Henry V, he realizes that the Battle of Agincourt is going to take place on St. Crispin's Day. Every day had a saint when you were a deeply religious Catholic country. And St. Crispin's Day was the day of the battle. And Henry V, at least in the play, I'm sure he did something like this in real life. He certainly didn't do anything like this around, because nobody had this language. Certainly Henry V didn't have this language. No other living human has had this language, I think. But what Shakespeare does is he realizes that on some level, Henry V must have had to basically give his team a pep talk, because they're looking out at being outnumbered 7-1 or whatever the number was, and they themselves were sick and poor and ragged, and not very many of them, and beat up and marching back and forth, and they're just looking at these panzer divisions, basically, these mounted French knights in glistening armor, every one of them a prince of some kind or a duke or something, coming charging at them, and he realizes, if I don't buck these people up, we're going to break. And by the way, historically, Most of the casualties that happened in edged weapon battles, swords and things like that, almost all of the major casualties happened after one side had broken. So you got these two lines of people hacking at each other, but they got shields and armor up front, and it's a bloodbath, and sure enough. But when one side turned and ran, the enemy cavalry just skewered them like they were just, like marshmallows on a stick. They just run them down and just killed thousands of them. And so Henry realized not only does his political ambition depend on winning this battle, but certainly their lives, and so he took it seriously. So that was the historical stage, really, that Shakespeare set to work on. And I expect that it had much the same effect on his audience that the opening of Patton had, the movie with George C. Scott, which basically is the opening of this movie, which is a pretty realistic movie, certainly for its day. It still holds up extremely well. But the opening of Patton, written by Francis Ford Coppola, by the way, is utterly stylized. It's unlike anything else in the movie. It apparently is a stage, but it doesn't look like any stage you've ever seen. There's an American flag the size of a barn in perfect paint on the wall behind him. You see George C. Scott not coming in from the side, coming in from the wings, but basically coming up from behind the stage. He's got Patton's chrome helmet on and his jodhpurs and all this stuff that Patton himself designed his own uniforms, and walks out and gives that speech where basically he is telling his men the same thing that Henry V told his men, that all good leaders tell their men whether they get recorded doing it or not. He basically said, yeah, there's a lot of them, and yeah, they're terrifying, but we're going to kick the living snot out of them. We're going to go through them like crap through a goose. We're going to use their guts to grease the treads of our tanks. And actually, I never really thought about this before, but there's a lot of similarities between those two speeches. I'd be utterly astonished if Coppola wasn't drawing heavily. Actually, Patton made that speech. Coppola refined it quite a bit, but Patton made a speech very much along those lines. And there are similar themes here. And basically what he's telling these scared men who are about to go into battle against long odds is he's basically saying to them, we're made of better stuff than they are. And when this day is over, or when this war is over, you will have been proud to be here, and people that weren't here will be ashamed that they weren't here. And in Henry V, that speech, that line is, and men in England now abed will hold their manhood cheap that they were not here. The idea that you will roll up your sleeves and you'll show your scars with advantages and tell the story of what happened here. Basically, he's saying you're going to go home heroes, and when you show people that you fought at Agincourt, you'll never have to pay for another drink again. And the people that we should pity are not those of us stuck here. We should pity the people back home who are going to miss this honor. That's essentially what Patton says in the beginning of the Patton movie. He basically says, we don't retreat. We're going to be advancing all the time. We're going to grab the enemy by the nose. And we're going to kick him in the ass. And we're going to kick the living hell out of him all the time. We're going to go through them like crap through a goose. And at the end of this, he says, he's so harsh and so, it's a very disciplinary speech. I don't want to hear anything about retreat. I don't want to hear this or that or so on. And then it ends on a very personal note, which Henry V's speech does too. He says, I'm proud. One more thing, I'd be proud to lead you fine men into battle anywhere at any time. And I forget how he set it up, but basically one of the key lines in that speech is, instead of him saying, people will hold their manhood cheap who were not here, Patton says, well, when this is over and your grandson is sitting on your knee and asking you what you did in the Great World War II, you won't have to say, well, son, I shoveled shit in Louisiana. And that's essentially exactly what Henry V is saying to his people. When this is over, those of you that survive are going to be envied by the people that were not here. And the beautiful thing about the Henry V speech is how the genius of Henry V, and I'm talking about Shakespeare's Henry V. I don't know much about the actual Henry V, although he really did conquer France with very few men. But in the play, he is soothing the fears of his men because there are so few, and people wanted to leave. Nobody wanted to be there. They all were sure they were going to be massacred, and that's certainly the way to bed, right? And what Henry's basically saying in that speech is, he starts off by saying, any man here who doesn't want to be here, we will give him his passport, and we will pay for his travel. We would not die among men like that. If you want to go, go. And so immediately he sets up that warrior bonding that is so essential to success in any kind of military endeavor. He's basically saying, if you're a coward, then go. Not going to stop you. We're not going to shoot you if you decide you don't want to fight. You don't want to fight, then go home. Go home now. We'll pay for it. In fact, I'll lay out the gold and I'll get you on a nice boat, get you right home right away. So if you're one of those cowards, go. And nobody went. Shelby Foote was talking about this with the Civil War in his incredible book, The Civil War, but I think he mentioned this actually in the Ken Burns movie. I know he mentioned it in the movie. And basically what he was saying, he was talking about the nature of courage, and people who are not in combat, myself included, often wonder how people find the courage to go into battle, and especially those kinds of battles, edged weapon battles, which is essentially just a butcher's shop of just hacking people's limbs off. How do people find the courage to go into that? And Shelby Foote was saying, when Robert E. Lee would ride up among his men on Traveler, this giant gray horse, Robert E. Lee was called the handsomest man in all of Christendom, and Robert E. Lee said, "Boys, I'm counting on you." Shelby Foote pointed out, and I think this is the essence of the whole thing, Shelby Foote pointed out that who had the courage to not go? Now it's back to peer pressure and social proof, right? I mean, he said everybody was scared. Nobody wanted to go into this battle. I seem to remember it was Sharpsburg or something like this, some horror, some nightmare. But Shelby Foote was saying, you may not have the physical courage for the battle, but who has the moral courage to basically say, well, you guys go and knock yourselves out because I'm getting out of here? He said it's almost nobody has that kind of courage. And Robert E. Lee knew that, and Patton knew it, and Henry V knew it, and all these great leaders know it. These military speeches, these moments of the pregame, the pregame speech, they seem to be built on the same model, and it makes perfect sense. The first thing you do is you say, anybody here who's a coward wants to go, go. What does that do? It basically forces these men to realize, well, I had my chance to go, and now I'm here, so I guess I'm in it, and I might as well do my best to survive it. And if it turns out that you lose 10% or 5% or 3% or 20% of your people who say, okay, well, in that case, thanks very much, we're out of here, goodbye, have a good fight. As Henry makes it a moral thing, an honor thing, we would not die in those men's company. But what he's really saying, and what he really understands, is it's better to have no men than to have men that you can't depend on. I'd rather be in the field with 10,000 men than with 50,000 men if 40,000 of those were doubtful. Because fear is a disease, and it spreads through the ranks very quickly. And first thing he does in that speech is to say to the cowards, basically, I'm more than willing to let you go home. Certainly you're not going home in honor, but you're not going home in chains. Just get on a boat, leave, go. You can save your life right now and just walk away. And he is basically inoculating himself and his army against those people who are going to run first. And when they start running, other people are going to start running. And as I said earlier, when the lines start running, that's when everybody gets killed. That's when everybody gets just speared in the back by enemy cavalry. That's how these casualties take place. So Henry V is doing an awful lot there, and this is finally going to your point of your question here, Daniel. But what Henry V does in that speech, in the St. Crispin's Day speech, is he bonds himself with his soldiers. Patton does that too, but he bonds himself with his soldiers. And I forget the exact wording, but it's something to the effect of, he who sheds his blood with me this day shall be my brother. And that no matter how base he may be, this will gentle his condition. He's basically saying, if you stay and fight with me, we'll be brothers. We'll be equals. You'll be like a king. You'll be like a king to me. And how do you resist that? And ultimately, when it's all said and done, what really happens in Henry V in that speech is Henry V is basically saying to his men, if we bleed together, we die together as equals, but I'm not going to be sitting on a hill like Xerxes looking down and seeing how the battle's going. I'm going to be in the front lines with you, and we're all going to live through this or die through it, but we're going to do it together. And that is unbelievably powerful. It's unbelievably powerful. And so now back to Shakespeare, and I'll get to the president about the question about the presidency. So what Shakespeare has done basically is he's taken every pregame motivational speech in the history of the world and put them together in a way that is unsurpassed. He captures the entire dynamic of it. He basically says, we few, we happy few, we band of brothers. And you feel suddenly not like, why the hell am I here? You feel privileged to be there. That's why the Marines commercials were so effective. The few, the proud, the Marines. They're saying, we don't want everybody. No, if you don't want to be a Marine, you don't want to go through this, have a nice day. SEALs are that way too. The whole motivation of BUDS is it BUDS? Basic Underwater Demolition Skills. SEAL training is designed to weed out the people who put their own limits above the limits of their group. Some people just don't have the physical strength for it, but when you get right down to it, it's really the emotional strength, it's the mental strength, spiritual strength to stay in this misery of Hell Week and not leave because your discomfort level is unimaginable to regular mortals. It's a fire assay. It's when you find some ore of some kind and you melt it. You put it in intense heat to see what it's really made out of. That's how you tell what things are. You've got to really put them under enormous stress. This is not just true of the military, it's true of anybody or anything. In order to find out what they're really made of, you have to basically make it almost unbearable in there. And then you'll know. There's a line from The Greatest Showman, which we've done 2 segments on now, which I love so much. And basically at the beginning of From Now On, Hugh Jackman basically says, when a man knows who his friends are when the walls won't hold and you're just surrounded by ruin, you know that what's left can only be the truth. After a catastrophe is over, you know who you can count on, and it's not a big percentage of the people in your life. So now on to the present thing. Specifically regarding the themes of leadership, loyalty, and patriotism. The whole last 10, 15 minutes have been about those themes, Daniel, and the question is, what really is the president of the United States? On paper, he's the chief executive. He's much like the president of a corporation. But certainly, since World War II, and undoubtedly well before then, probably into just a few years after the Revolution, the idea of the president as the actual chief executive in terms of the guy that runs the company is just utterly unmanageable, and no one pretends to think that it is manageable. The federal government is so enormous and so huge that even with competent secretaries, they are barely able to understand the basics of what goes on in the State Department or the Defense Department or whatever the case may be. It's all basically administered by sergeants, bureaucratic sergeants or whatever. People who have a very specific set of skills and knowledge and who just go out and execute. So what is the president if he's not the actual chief executive? We know he has the power to sign bills, and that is enormous political power. There's no question that's true. We know he's commander-in-chief, and that makes sense, and that's also enormous power. But putting aside the fact that the president's day-to-day existence is not basically managing the company, and since foreign threats don't come up so often that the commander-in-chief card is the main reason why we have the guy, what essentially is the president? What is he today? And what has he been for quite a long time? And in my mind, he's a spokesperson. He's a cheerleader. He's the kind of person that ideally has the kind of heart, and be nice if you had just a fraction of the tongue, of Henry V in terms of the President of the United States' job, in my opinion, is to convince the American people to do the things that he thinks that they should be doing. Not telling them to do it, not ordering them to do it, to convince them to do it, to make it their choice to want to do these things, to go to World War II or whatever the case may be, or go to the moon or whatever. His job is to understand the mood of the people, listen to the mood of the people. I think Peggy Noonan said that the idea of Reagan telling the American people what they should or should not doing simply was anathema to him. He couldn't even comprehend it. He believed he was there to serve the citizens of the country. And that's true. But honestly, you do have to lead people. And this is the difference between leaders and managers. I know he's on the other team. I never for a second got the sense that Barack Obama was a leader, ever. He never did anything that inspired me. Nothing. Not one thing did he ever do that inspired me. Neither did Bill Clinton. John F. Kennedy certainly did. There were things that Franklin Roosevelt, who I think was tremendously destructive for this country, were inspiring. And so if you don't have that ability to rally people, then you are simply an office holder. You're just the most important bureaucrat in the system. But every now and then, you have an opportunity, and that's the word, isn't it? You have an opportunity. Among the great battle speeches that I'm familiar with in terms of context, not so familiar with in terms of the actual wording, was the speech that was given. Oh my God. I just hate it when things fly out of my head, especially when I can see the guy. When Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain is on a Little Round Top on the second day of the Battle of Gettysburg, and he knows that the Confederates have to take this hill. Let's rephrase that. They don't have to. If they don't take the hill, it doesn't mean they're going to lose. But if they do take the hill, it certainly means they're going to win. If he and his regiment, the 20th Maine, which is on the far left of the Union line, if they break and run, then all of the other regiments are going to break and run just like a zipper unzipping. Not only is the fear contagious, but these guys are going to be hit on the side where they have no protection and they're not ready. And so he understands that what happens in his regiment of 300 or 400 guys, whatever it was, in the 20th Maine, they are going to have to stand. And if they don't stand, they're going to lose the battle. And if they lose the battle of Gettysburg, then they'll probably lose, now for God's sake. This drives me nuts. It's absolutely flown out of my head. It drives me barking mad when this happens. Harrisburg. I'll double check that. Of course, yes, Harrisburg. So it's pretty clear to Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain there that, all right, so we're the left of the Union Army. If we run, then the Confederates get this hill. If they get this hill, they can put artillery up here and enfilade our entire line. So if we lose this hill, we're going to lose the Battle of Gettysburg. If we lose the Battle of Gettysburg, we're going to lose the capital of Pennsylvania, which is Harrisburg. And if we lose the capital of a northern state, that may bring the British into the war on the side of the South, and that means we lose the war as well. So basically, guys, the future of the country is going to depend on what we do here in the next half hour. That's a motivational thing in itself. But the thing that Chamberlain said was And he was a teacher of rhetoric and so on at Bowdoin College, I want to say. So he was a teacher, he's a school teacher. And I don't think he gave this much thought in advance. I think he just said what he felt. But basically, he didn't say to them, okay, this is this horrible duty that we're going to have to do. It's fallen on us. He said, boys, not once in 100 years are men given this opportunity. Not once in 100 years are people given this blessing, this chance to carry history on your shoulders right now. That's a motivational thing. And sure enough, the Alabama regiment keeps coming up the hill, and they keep knocking it back and coming up the hill, knocking it back. They're getting stronger and stronger. The guys on the 20th Maine are running out of ammunition. They're throwing rocks at these guys during some of the later charges. He basically kept close order, same way they did it at Rorke's Drift. They held their position, kept it tight. He built a little, basically cranked the edge of the line around so that they could be defending against a flank attack. And his discipline and his relationship with his men, who are as human as anybody else, and there's a lot of running away during the Civil War. And the fact that he was standing there in the middle of all of it with his sword and his pistol gave these men the courage to withstand these horrific charges, led by very brave men in the Alabama regiment that was trying to take the hill. And then finally, when they were out of ammunition and they knew that that the next charge was coming and that they simply didn't have any more bullets to shoot at these guys, probably didn't have any more rocks to throw at them either, he had a choice. He could either surrender or he could stand there and fight these guys without ammunition and just wait to be shot down like dogs, or he could tell them to put the bayonets on their rifles if they hadn't already and charge. And that's what he did. He led a charge, and that charge so shocked these Alabamans who had been pretty badly abused by the Maine boys that they held the hill. They held the hill. They held the line. They held the line. They won the battle. They won the battle. They won the war. That was the high point of the Confederacy. So this is what Shakespeare does, is he captures these exceedingly complex behavioral interactions, powerful interactions. And that fear response, that fight or flight response, is pretty deeply ingrained. I'm very happy that we've had so many remarkable men and women in our military who have made it possible for me to go through life without having to experience that myself, for which I still feel ashamed, to be honest with you. But when you're looking death in the face, it's very, very tempting to run away. And if you don't run away, it's going to be because you don't run away because you don't want to look bad in front of your friends. And if you're going to maintain your position as an effective fighting force, that means you have to do it the right way, which means you have to have either respect for this individual officer or for whatever. But basically, in these moments of great danger, of horrible being horribly outnumbered, it's that leadership thing that comes through. Same thing was true, as I say, in Rorke's Drift. These two guys charred in Bromhead, two were they lieutenants, I guess. One was an engineer, another one was known to be kind of a deaf and sort of a lunatic, and they were the JV team. You know, the main British Army is out there to San Luana, and they're going to go out there and make the Zulu War over in a couple days, and they get completely wiped out, and you got a couple hundred guys at this hospital, basically, this little series of houses, and they've got an hour to prepare for the fact that 7,000 Zulus are coming their way with blood on their spears. And Chart and Bromhead just got to work. They just got to work. Here's our first position. We're going to stack these bags of grain here, these mealie bags. We're going to stack them here, make a little line here, and then we're going to have a fallback position here. We're going to be able to shorten our line enormously. We're going to hold them off as long as we can out there. And if they get to the point where they're overwhelming us, then we pull back to this more compact position, and we'll hold them here. And then inside of that, he built a little mini fortress out of these bags, and inside that he had a sort of a Sunday punch of riflemen who he kept hidden. And sure enough, the Zulus eventually came over the walls, burned down the hospital. They retreated to their interior position. More and more and more of them are coming. They hold the line at that interior position. These guys pop up over the top and open fire, and they survived. More Victoria Crosses, which is our Congressional Medal of Honor, were awarded that day than ever in the history of the British Empire. I don't know what the number was. I want to say it was 24 or something like that out of a contingent of 200 guys. So as an answer, a 45-minute answer to your question, Daniel, the President of the United States ideally should be capable of a speech that at least has the elements of Henry V's speech. At least have the elements of it. And those elements, as I said, are pretty consistent. Those of you that don't want to fight can leave. We need men now. We need heroes here now. And much more importantly than that, whatever happens to us is going to happen to me too. I'm going to be right here with all of you. I'm going to be right here in the front. We're all going up or down together. Nothing more demoralizing than watching your leader go running towards the hills or sit up on the top of the cliffs like Xerxes, while all of the Athenian generals and admirals were down there in the phalanxes or on the trimarines and living and dying with the rest of them. And Victor Davis Hanson has an awful lot to say about this idea of the motivation of Western armies coming from a sense of democracy and a sense of shared risk, and that's why they're so effective in warfare. Another half hour maybe. Okay, so far so good. From Eric Blake, hail honest William Whittle, and of the fair and noble Earl of the fair and noble daywalkers that dwelleth in the town of Tinsel. Well met. How now? What's your opinion on the No Fear Shakespeare translations of his plays into modern English? I'm not terribly familiar with them. I've got a pretty good idea what they're like. I think if you're going to put Shakespeare in modern English, and by the way, I've given it enormous thought. I've damn near sat down and wrote Hamlet's soliloquy in modern slang as close as I could get it. You know? I mean, if a millennial were to say that, the first things out of his mouth would be FML, you know? Honestly. This is just effed up. I'm just gonna do it. I'm just gonna off myself. I mean, really, it's nothing to live for, and life is miserable, and I don't see any reason to go on except, you know, then what? Maybe we'll all go to hell, and maybe things will be worse, you know. And maybe just the fact that I don't have the guts to do it is why I'm trying to talk myself out of it. Basically the speech. So I think when you have people talking about doing Shakespeare in modern English, you are basically hoping to get people on board who wouldn't be on board otherwise with the ideas of the plays, but without the language of the plays. And I think that it is better than nothing, but not nearly so good as a good actor who does Shakespeare, not necessarily in original pronunciation, because that's actually sometimes very hard to understand because it's early modern English. But as I said at the very beginning of this, when you see Shakespeare acted, the motivations become very, very clear and effortless. And you quickly lose the language. You quickly lose the language as a sense of being a barrier. Now, of course, you have to have a little bit of a vocabulary to understand it. I suppose there's a world which I would probably choose where in certain circumstances I might substitute a word or two for words that people simply don't know. Welkin was a word that I didn't know. I think, was it welkin? I'd never heard the term before. But Shakespeare uses it, I want to say, in Titus Andronicus or what's the other one? Coriolanus. Actually, I was saying earlier it was Titus Andronicus I like so much. It's actually Coriolanus I like so much. And could so relate to. But in any event, they were talking about welkin, which means the sky or heavens, and so on. I'm a little reluctant to go halfway. I mean, somebody just pointed out in the comment section, as I mentioned earlier, if you're going to take the language out of Shakespeare and just keep the plot, then take it all and do West Side Story, which was excellent. For those of you that don't know, West Side Story is precisely the story of Romeo and Juliet. Instead of the Montagues and the Capulets, you got the Sharks and the Jets. You've got two young people from warring gangs who fall in love with each other, and bad things happen, and it's a one-to-one modernization of Romeo and Juliet, and I think it in many ways is better than Romeo and Juliet. But there's Shakespeare without the Shakespeare. I think that's better than having Hamlet say, you know, to be or not to be. Well, I guess that's what we're asking. I don't know what the No Fear Shakespeare of Hamlet's soliloquy sounds like, but I suspect it's something like that. So yeah, you're probably getting 20% of it, 30% of it to people who maybe don't get any of it. It's an improvement over nothing, but it's not what it could be. That reading we played earlier, even though it was hard to understand the language, was acted in such a way that it was very accessible. You could see what was going on. It wasn't him declaiming, things. He wasn't simply declaiming into the air these philosophical principles, which all of us must. He was sitting down and talking to the audience as if it was a friend. He was talking to his cat or his he's just here's look. This is the issue, right? I mean, what should I do? I mean, on one hand, I could do this, and on the other hand, I could do that. And I don't know. It was so immediate and personable that even if he wasn't speaking English, if you were to jumble the words and make him speak gibberish but with the same inflection, you'd still get 20 or 30% of it. I tend to be against these kind of things because I don't think that anybody is going to be going to see No Fear Shakespeare on their own. I don't think that people who would not go and see Shakespeare are suddenly motivated to go see No Fear Shakespeare in modern language and enjoy it. So if you're going to rope them up and hustle them into the theater, you might as well give them the full dose. That would be my answer to that, I would suppose. Filtering here. Somebody's mentioning some other guy, Clovens something, who apparently spends a lot of time talking about Shakespeare. I suspect I know who we're talking about. He's undoubtedly watching this, making notes as fast as he can. So I'm not even going to grace him or raise him, and there you go. Eric Blake writes in the comments, honestly, why set Shakespeare in modern day, but with the old language? That's going halfway, but it's not. It's not, in my opinion. So the final question, going back to the previous one on modern interpretations and so on, many productions of Shakespeare have been set in more modern eras than they were written in. The movie version of Titus Andronicus with Anthony Hopkins was interesting in that they were wearing business suits and the Goths had different kind of clothing on. And it wasn't exactly modern clothing, but it certainly wasn't togas either. I've seen versions of Shakespeare in the present day that made it more accessible because all you're changing there is you're changing the parts that aren't Shakespeare. in other words, if you do a version of Hamlet set in Germany in the 1930s or whatever, your original costume director is offended, and that's it. You've still got the same words with the same motivation, the same action, but you've got them in an environment that seems more familiar to you. This is the opposite of what No Fear Shakespeare or these modern English versions seem to be. You're taking away the words, and all it is the words. It's the words. That's it. He's not the only person who ever wrote about anger or fear or jealousy or murder or anything. He's the only person who wrote about them in such a way that he captured the essence of them because of his words, because of the words he used. Shakespeare without Shakespeare's words isn't Shakespeare. Shakespeare without Shakespeare's costumes is Shakespeare. That's my opinion on it anyway. Moving on. Okay, we got something of some promise here. Oh, wow. All right, I think I might do a shorter one tonight. Corey Langsley made a bunch of quotes that are interesting. Actually, I was going to just kind of discuss them all, but probably just better just kind of fly through them. There's a line in Macbeth that says, "What's done cannot be undone," which seems like a pretty simple idea, but actually is pretty profound. How much time do we spend? In fact, this is the entire left, right? The entire left is basically saying, well, if we got rid of guns, then this would happen. First of all, it wouldn't. But secondly, it can't happen. It can't happen. You can't get rid of them. They will not. There is no world where America is disarmed. And so to spend so much time talking about it is to simply waste your breath, because what's done cannot be undone. Whether it was good or bad, you can have that argument, but you cannot basically say, sure, would be nice if there were no guns, because first of all, it wouldn't be nice, but secondly, it's not happening. You might as well come up with a gun control situation, or you might as well try to deal with the murder problem in inner cities by making assumptions of how you would structure the world if people could fly. It should just fly away from dangers. It's as realistic as this. So yeah, that's pretty straightforward. Julius Caesar, cowards die many times before their deaths. The valiant never taste of death but once. And that's been basically bastardized into, a coward dies 1,000 deaths and a hero only dies once. It's another profound idea. How many people are there that are so filled with the fear of dying that every day is robbed of joy or even satisfaction? How many people really do die every day, suffer the grief and the incapacitation of it, the crippling ruin of the present because of this dread of the future, and we know it's coming. I don't know how it happened, and I don't know exactly how anyway. I've mentioned this quite a few times on this show. I have some idea about how it happened. I don't know how I lost my fear of dying. I have no doubt whatsoever that if I'm in a situation where somebody's got a gun to my head or a knife or something, I'm going to be plenty afraid. I'm not trying to tell you that I'd be utterly fearless in the face of mortal danger. I'm not trying to say that at all. But facing that moment doesn't particularly bother me. And I don't know how I got there, but I think it's because I started to do things with my life that made me realize that I haven't wasted this life, that I did something useful. And that can be, when I say as simple as, I mean as critically important as raising a good person and being a father or mother to good people. That's a life well lived. But I know some people very well whose enjoyment of life is limited and in some cases completely eliminated by the fear of what's coming. And since there's nothing we can do about that, it seems tragic. You do die 1,000 deaths, many, many deaths before your real death. For me, I think the thing that was probably the most effective in essentially getting rid of my fear of death, many people don't fear death because of their profound religious faith, and I admire these people very much. But that's not me. I just simply thought about it. Like everybody else, I was terrified of it, and then I just thought about it. I made it a companion. And I don't want to say I made it a friend, but I made it a familiar. I don't think about this every day by any means, but I do think about it often enough I think about it quite a lot in terms of the repercussions of it, not so much the personal aspects of it. I often think, okay, what is this American life worth? You know, never hungry, never cold, never bored now, no pain ever. Or if so, for just a limited amount of time till you get to the hospital and they pump you full of Dilaudid. And living in peace and go shopping in supermarkets where the finest food in the history of the world is just laid at your feet. And if it's not a perfect plum, you throw it away. And, you know, no one's ever lived like this, ever. And if we lose our virtue, they won't continue to live there. No one ever will live like this again. But what is this worth? In other words, people died to provide me with that existence. Many people gave up their lives to provide me and the people I love and the people you love and you yourselves with that kind of existence, that kind of Disneyland charmed existence. And so if you have any sense of honor or fairness or decency or compassion, any sense of sympathy at all, you certainly have to start asking yourself, what is the price for this? And so far, many of us have gotten through life without having been submitted a bill. But if you get a bill for it, if you do get presented with the bill for the happiness and the peace that we experience every day, do you pay it or do you run? And what that leads me to is a sense that if it's like the insurance thing in a weird sort of way, right? Everybody has to pay for insurance, and you can't pay for your insurance after your car's smashed. In other words, you can't go out and smash up a $30,000 car and then go and buy an insurance policy and pay $200 a month to get it fixed. And once it's fixed, stop paying. You have to. You're either part of the deal or you're not. And I started doing what I was doing and gave up any chance of working in Hollywood as an editor or as a writer, filmmaker, any of that stuff. That's why I get so excited about the Star Citizen game. It finally gives me a chance to use the tools that I have and that I've been wanting to use for years and years and years. But I gave that up, and I knew when I did it I was giving it up. And my calculation on this was very simple. This was right at the beginning of the Iraq War. It was right after 9/11, and I realized it didn't just apply to the now, it applied to all of the history before that. There are 18-year-old young men who are giving their lives, they're having the only life they ever had shot out from them. Never had any of the experience that I ever had, never. None of them. And they did this out of a sense of obligation to somebody that they didn't know. And I remember thinking, how base do you have to be afraid of, not afraid of, let me rephrase that, I think most people are afraid of it, but how base do you have to be to not be willing to pay that tab if it's submitted to you? You know, I mean, I'm pushing 60. April, I'm going to be 59 years old. And I can truthfully say that in the panoply of human existence, I've never had a bad day. I've had days that I thought were very bad. I've had many days that were very lonely, very sad, and so on. But in terms of the life of people on this planet, I've never had a bad day. what's that worth? Many of us have to deal with the loss of pets, and it just rips your heart out. And it's just horrible. And one of the things that's worst about it is that if you really love your animal, you take upon yourself responsibility for their death, even though this may be happening tomorrow, a month from now, a week from now. When you have a terminally ill pet, they usually let you know when they're ready. And the fear of that drive down to the vet's office is very, very, very powerful. Nobody wants to make that drive. Nobody. And having done it 3 times with animals that I considered family, and 5 or 6 times with animals I considered very nearly family, all I remember of it is that the drive back was easier than the drive there. But when you're confronted with this, and a person who I like very much, who's been doing my hair for years now, just lost a dog and had to put the dog down on Christmas night. She had spent the previous couple of years every 2 hours waking up to get the dog medication. The dog was blind. This kind of care. Some people think, oh, it's just nuts. I admire it more than anything. I admire it more than I can say. I know when I was flat broke and I was really, really not having rent or electric money, when my cat Texas was breathing hard and I came home, I spent $3,000 that I didn't have to make sure that this was terminal, and it was. And so when you confront people, or when you confront this moment, this horrific moment where this animal that loves you and trusts you, you pick up in your arms and you drive down to have them leave the earth. You're the agent of their destruction. The 2 things I'll say about that are this: if you're not willing to make that drive, it's because you love yourself more than you love the animal. Your fear of the sadness of it is overcoming your love of that animal. You think you're not going to do it because you love them too much, but if you really loved them, you would go, because when you have a terminal illness, and that may just be old age, there's no getting out of it. It's not like there's a 10% chance. It's you just don't want to go, and you will not go, and that animal that you love will suffer because of your cowardice. So there's that aspect of it. But the thing I usually say to comfort other people and to comfort myself is simply this: when you have to lose a pet or deal with any kind of death in the family, friends, people that have been a part of your life, the thing I constantly come back to, just using a pet as an example, is this is what it cost. This is the cost. This is what the cost is for all of that companionship and friendship and smiles and joy and all the rest of it that comes from an animal, all the good times, all the great times. This is the price of it. It's not free. You don't get it for free. It costs something, and it costs an awful lot of pain. And to some degree, that will never leave you. That's a bill you're going to pay a large amount of, and then slowly pay less and less. But you're going to be making payments on that for the rest of your life on some degree or other. You never really get over them. You never really stop missing them. It always hurts some degree. And so the question is it worth it? Because you don't get to have your cake and eat it too. You have to make a decision. Do you want 10 years or 5 years or 20 years of companionship at the cost of maybe 2 or 3 days or maybe a week or 2, maybe longer, maybe shorter, of just plain agony? And if you say no, it's not worth it, you're trying to buy insurance after your car's been smashed, right? You've got 20 years of history or whatever with this animal and companionship, and now you don't want to pay the price for it. You don't want to do what you need to do, what you have to do, because you're too selfish. It's horrible. It's the most horrible thing I've had to go through, and that's an indication of how amazing my life has been. So these are the thoughts that go through my mind when I think about this idea that cowards die many times before their deaths. The valiant never taste of death but once. People with courage to face the inevitability of death are people who get to live every day unburdened by the fear. And my understanding is that Woody Allen has always been living in absolute terror of dying, and that's a talented man. I think a pretty despicable person in a lot of ways, but a really talented person whose life has been misery because they simply just didn't have the courage to face it. They just didn't have the courage. I'd known about the everybody knows the 7 deadly sins, and few people know the 7 cardinal virtues, but it was only a couple years ago that I'd heard so many philosophers say that among the virtues, first among them by far is courage. That without courage you have no honor, without courage you have no generosity, no compassion, nothing. It's all based on courage. You have to have the courage. You have to be able to do things you don't want to do. It's probably a pretty decent working definition of it, or maybe do things that you're afraid to do. It's the oldest saw in the world, but it's the essence of the problem. It's not that you're not afraid. Courage doesn't mean that you're not afraid. Courage means you're going to go despite the fact that you're afraid. And that is a quality that needs to be instilled in people. And this is either done through instruction from wonderful parents or religious instruction, or in some of our cases, just a great deal of self-examination. Let's see what else we got. We'll end up with these. There's some other quotes there, and we could just do this all day. I might maybe either next week or one more time do a series of quotes and just talk about what they mean, what they captured, in the same way that we kind of got to the essence, I think, of the Hamlet soliloquy. Macbeth is also about pride, enormous pride, but it's also about madness, and it's also about. I'm sorry, did I say Macbeth? I didn't mean to say Macbeth. I meant to say King Lear. Sorry about that. Lear, I should have said the Scottish play. Lear is a madman, but his madness comes from his age. King Lear begins with him basically sitting around his court with his 3 daughters and basically commanding them to tell him how much they love him. And he's going to divide up the kingdom 3 ways. And Cordelia, the youngest daughter, goes first. She says, "Do you love me? You know, will you always love me with all of your heart?" And Cordelia says, "Father, you know, I've always loved you as a father, but when I get married, I'm going to have a husband, and I'm going to love him at least half as much as I love you, so I will not love you with the same wholeness of my heart when I have a husband to love." And for this, Lear banishes her. And then the other sisters, through intrigues and so on, all depart Lear. And so it's this, just the pride of it, that, you know, the fact that he wouldn't be given this tongue bath from the people who were his entire heart, just the arrogance of it, the cheap pride of it, drives him mad. And in his insanity, by the way, I think the funniest thing I've read of Shakespeare was the words that Shakespeare chose to put in there for that one paragraph where Lear is just simply barking mad. He just lists a bunch of things that are just absolutely unrelated to anything else. It's really, really very funny. But so you end up with this person who was king of England, out in the rain, out in the elements, covered in mud, and making a crown out of sticks. And the length of the fall, you know, the height of it is so instructive. That's what Lear does for us. Lear and all the rest of them. Hamlet exists, and Hamlet is great, and Shakespeare is immortal because Hamlet encapsulates in less than a page the entire dilemma of suicide, which is a serious issue for just about anybody at some point in their lives or another. Whether it's at the end of your life or whatever the case may be, maybe it's, whether it's dashing into a burning building, doesn't matter. The essence of it, all of it, is encapsulated in a page, a couple of lines, which we played earlier. Lear shows us how kings can be reduced to idiots covered in mud and rags, living literally in pigsties, with crowns of branches around their head, maintaining this illusion of their former greatness. And it's so shocking that for some people, it should be enough for you to realize that you don't have to be quite this proud, that this is how you will go. Whom gods destroy, they first make insane. Whom God destroys, another Star Trek title. I bet there's 5 or 6 of them in the original series at least. Othello is about jealousy and the power of jealousy, and how jealousy is magnified by a sense of inferiority, how a sense of inferiority makes jealousy a killing emotion, makes it powerful enough to be murdered for. Othello's immediate discomfort, and then just plain agony, and finally his murdering of his innocent wife is driven by his insecurity, driven by the fact that he's a Moor. He's basically a black man marries a white princess. And when Iago puts in his ear the idea that she's fooling around, and she's not, it's the insecurity of Othello that drives him to this jealousy, because he's always felt not good enough, always. And here he has finally got this prize, and now the prize is slipping away because of his perceived defects. It drives him to murder. Aaron the Moor in Titus Andronicus is a villain who delights in evil, as I said earlier, simply delights it. He said, if I had one wish, I think that I would do 10,000 more of the most awful things I do. He has a line where he basically says he has gone to graves and dug up the bodies of people and stood them in front of the doors of their friends and carved into their skin as if into the bark of a tree with a knife. You may think that your grief is over, but it's not over. He's basically dug up dead bodies, put them in front of somebody's house, and marked them with the fact that you thought you were over this, but you're not. That's just pure evil. But there's nothing like that in the real world. Nobody's like that. Hitler's not like that. That's metaphysical evil. That's the idea of evil. That's cartoon evil. It's extremely powerful and it's wonderful stuff, but it's not real, and it's not intended to be real. But the evil of Iago, who many people have called the greatest villain and antagonist in the history of literature, and you certainly make that case. The evil of Iago lives every day. I mean, there's I don't think I have a drop of Iago in me, not a drop. I'm not saying I don't have my faults, but deceitfulness and lying and schemery, I'm just not smart enough for it. I just don't know how to do it. But when you understand and you see the felicity, not just the mental ease, but the emotional simplicity of doing evil for your own benefit, either for personal gain, political gain, financial gain, or sometimes simply to strike at people and things you just don't like. There is much, Iago, in the world, much, to varying degrees. And if you get to see it all in one place at its most vivid, saturated red, it awakens you to the possibilities of much paler shades of pink that go on all the time around you. For those of you not familiar with it, Othello is the story of a Moorish general of Venice, I want to say. And not only does he suffer from his inferiority complex, but essentially the play's about Iago. Othello is not in any way he's not the motivator of that play. He's not a MacGuffin, but it's not his play. He doesn't do anything. He is acted upon rather than acting upon others. That's why I think it's Iago's play. The whole play is just a really quite brilliantly thought out caper show. It's a caper movie. It's Ocean's 11. It's basically how clever can one person be, which really means how clever can the writer be to set up a series of actions that are so intricate that when they come together, you realize, my God, this person is incarnate genius of evil. But the evil of Iago is an achievable ego. It's not the same ego as standing on the scaffold, wishing you could do 10,000 more evil things. It's the scheming of somebody that smiles at you and pretends to be your friend because they want something that you've got. It's the fundamental dishonesty and falseness that is the source of so much of our trouble. You want to talk about pride? Iago is so proud that he doesn't feel any remorse. There's no lesson for him to learn in this. He doesn't learn any lessons. He's pure calculation. He's just a reptile. He's a psychopath. He's a sociopath. He has no human feelings at all, none. He's not capable of being redeemed. There's nothing to redeem. He's just a shell of calculation and malice. But when you watch him work, when you watch Iago at work in Othello, you will see how people have treated you in life, and you will see a very pale reflection of Shakespeare's genius in concentrating human experience. That's really, I guess, what it is. I rather like that sentence, actually. His genius is to concentrate human experience into a character, or sometimes even just a few lines of dialogue or monologue. And he encapsulates the entire transaction and turns the colors up so high that you can see its reflection in almost everything. That's the profound nature of Shakespeare, and that's why I wanted to do 2 hours on William Shakespeare, and we may do another 2 hours. I do like the theme shows very much. And once again, sorry for the delay in getting that clip up there, but I do love that, very much love that Ben doing that Hamlet soliloquy and as it actually sounded to the people in the Globe Theater. So there. I have Othello to finish. I thought I was going to read. I told myself I would read all of them, and I got about, 10 pages into King John, and then I realized now you can either live up to this little objective you set yourself and suffer through it, or you can realize that was driven by pride too. I wanted to be able to say I've read every play that William Shakespeare ever wrote. I'm not going to read every play. I'm not going to read John. I'm not going to read. I'm not going to read Henry the Second. I might read Henry the Fourth. There's some good stuff in there with Falstaff and so on, and I'll probably read Henry the Eighth. But I'm not going to read them all. And I wouldn't have read Romeo and Juliet after the first act if it hadn't been so famous and had so many interesting words in it. Romeo and Juliet to me was such a very primitive piece of work for Shakespeare because it's a reflection on the genius of him in the rest of his career. The motivations driving the language are not up to the language. Hark what light through yonder window breaks, 'tis the east and Juliet is the sun. That's magnificent writing. But it's from a guy who caught a glimpse of this creature and you just don't buy it. There's a lot of things in Shakespeare that you don't buy. I think it's Coriolanus where lifelong enemies suddenly become. Coriolanus goes to his lifelong enemy who he's beaten in battle after battle after battle. It basically says, Rome has betrayed me. Now I'm standing here before you. I will either serve you or you can kill me right now. It's one of those other, I don't care. And then the guy basically wraps his arms around him and said, oh, you have no idea how much this means to me. I don't know if I really believe that either, but that doesn't matter because it's capturing the dynamics of it. It's all there. And I think that will do it for episode number 175 of the Stratosphere Lounge, which is more astonishing to me than it is to you. So, if Dave Big Booty says, do you have to see it as a play or can you see it? Can it be seen as a movie? I'm very, very glad you asked that, Dave Big Booty. Big Booty, sorry. I would say, and there may be a better example, but I would say, for God's sake, go and rent or watch on Netflix or iTunes or wherever you can get it, Henry V. But make sure it's Kenneth Branagh's Henry V. Because he captures kind of the grit and the dirt of it. And Kenneth Branagh plays Henry V as he was. I don't know how old he was when he went on this crusade in France. I want to say he was 24, 25. So he was a young man, died early. And Branagh captures that, just the grit, just the certainly the ambition, because there's a lot of negative qualities there. The ambition, and the drive and the genius of him, but the charm. That's the word I'm looking for. What Kenneth Branagh has the charm to make me believe. The Band of Brothers speech. So I would recommend that. I have not seen that. I just read Titus. What am I on it now? No, I just finished it yesterday. Titus Andronicus. There's an Anthony Hopkins version called Titus. I saw a couple clips from that, and I was amazed at how clear things that I just read were now that I saw them actually acted. So I would recommend that pretty highly. I saw Branagh's Hamlet, and I would recommend you see that too. I think it's probably the best Hamlet I've seen. I just don't like the Laurence Olivier stuff for the reasons we've been talking about all night. I thought that that what Branagh was doing was more believable, and yet the monologue he does stiff as a rod in front of a mirror. When I think personally, it needs to be much more of a frenzy. It's issued when people do Hamlet's soliloquy. By the way, if you go on YouTube, you can find 4 or 5 versions. David Tennant, who played Doctor Who, does one. That's not bad. There's one done for the BBC on the War of the Roses. Wait a minute, that may not be Hamlet. But there's a number of famous actors doing Hamlet, and some not famous actors. And I think the one that Ben did earlier is the best I've seen. But so many people make the mistake of playing Hamlet and let's just stay with that monologue, not forget the play and the character. So many actors and so many interpretations of it, Laurence Olivier and Gielgud and all the rest, speak those lines as if those lines were pre-written. They speak them as if they're written in advance. They speak them as if Hamlet has been rehearsing them in his head for years. That's how they come out anyway. They come out with a sense that all of this has been decided. But when you look at what the words are, when you look at what he's actually saying, it's not like it's been decided. It's not an oration that is given to the vapors in the air. It is not. It's not a cry to the great unknown. It's a guy who's wrestling with a problem in real time, and he doesn't know what the answer is. Why he goes back and forth. To be or not to be. That's the question. Do I suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or do I simply off myself? some part of me wants to actually do it and record it, although I imagine I'd find it extremely embarrassing. But I've often wanted to try, well, not often, for the last 2 weeks, I've wanted to try it in a, not changing a word of the language, but doing it with a modern sensibility, kind of a 21st century kind of a body language and a 21st century kind of a pace. People, in many cases, for previous ages, were much more stoic than we were. Good morrow to you, sir, and said, "Hey, buddy, how's it going?" And I think if you, as far as I'm concerned, as speaking as a writer here, if you use the words and you don't change the words, then any interpretation you put on it is legitimate, as far as I'm concerned. I'd like to try it. I'd have to memorize it. It's not that hard to memorize since you know so much of it. You just have to string those pieces together. It'd be fun. But that's how I would play it. I'd play it as if a guy was... I would play it as a guy who was speaking aloud while he was on a road trip or maybe driving to work. I'd do it like I would do it if I was talking to myself in traffic. And, you know, all right, here's our choice. To be or not to be. That's the question. And get all of the emoting out of it and just do it in real time and try to get to the guts of the thought processes, because Shakespeare builds them in there. By the way, something I never forgot, one of those moments that just burns themselves into your memory, and this is our outro for tonight, after which we will excellent. I don't know how he pronounces that. You pronounce that word. He doesn't say exit. He says EXUENT, which I think means everybody leaves. But when I was a theater major, I never particularly wanted to be an actor. I'd done some fooling around in it, and I had a kind of a comic sense, but I was not a good actor at all. I was not a good actor because I was far too self-conscious and had nothing like the kind of courage it takes to be a really good actor back then, or even be an okay actor. But mostly I was in it for the writing, and I was interested in writing, and I loved directing actors. I loved it. You know, sometimes I feel like I have something interesting to say, and I liked working with them. It was like working with clay. But I was in this acting class taught by a guy named David Shelton, who was the only person in the department who really knew what he was doing, and everybody knew that he was the only guy who really knew. Dr. Shelton had been stricken by polio as a kid, and he had a terrible limp, and I think that that never left him. That he was really quite a bitter guy, and really could really cut you to the quick. Many years later, I caught up and talked with him about this, and he said he was trying to do favors to people who he knew were not going to. I mean, there's some people just not trainable. And he basically told him, "You're never going to be an actor," and we thought it was so cruel at the time, when in point of fact, it's the same kind of kindness as taking your dying pet to the vet. But I'll never forget this. We were in an acting class, and it wasn't Shakespeare, and some actor up there was basically fudging the lines. He got it close, you know, bits, fragments of it, and the rest of it he just kind of filled in. And Dr. Shelton said, "I heard what you just said, and I've got the book here, the play." And what he really said was this, and he points out what the actual language was going to be. And then he said the thing I never forgot. He said, "You have a moral obligation as an actor to get every single word right. A writer will spend a night or a year or a lifetime getting the words in precisely the right order, and that's not what you're good at. You have to read the words as they're written. The interpretation you put on them, that's yours and that's legitimate, but you don't get to rewrite the script. You don't get to use words that you come up with because you're too lazy to memorize the words that you're supposed to be saying. If you were a professional, this is what you'd be doing." And I remember being so impressed by that, just so impressed by it, because I'd done some writing by that point. I'd done a fair amount of writing, and it's really it. I lose my mind when people make the slightest edits to things that I've written. Certainly, you know, if you get to be a decent writer, it gets to be automatic. You're not really analyzing it so much as this just doesn't feel right. This doesn't belong here. It either belongs somewhere else, or as you get to be a better writer, how about if we just throw it away? Do we need it? Well, I really, really, really like it. I thought it was really, really clever and really, really funny and really, really insightful. Yeah, okay, but if you cut it out, would you know it was gone? No. Well, then cut it out. And that's when you get to be big shot author that you behold before you today. In any event, that'll do it for number 175. And thanks as always for our members for keeping the lights on here. We are enormously grateful to all of you. And to my Strato Lounger friends, who I just consider to be family now and have for many years. It's good to be here, and I hope to be considerably more focused in 2018. 2017 was a year of trying to find out what to do and how to do it, and I feel like we're starting to get that narrowed down a little bit. In any event, that'll do it for our Stratosphere Lounge show. You all be careful out there, and we will see you next time.